All right, welcome everyone to SQL Friday. This is number 97, and we have Deborah Melkin on the call, who is going to talk about database deployments methods demystified. And it's the first time you do this session, so I'm really honored you want to do it on SQL Friday.
Well, I'm honored you're having me.
I don't have an opening slide or anything, so I'm gonna let you present yourself. I think all I'm gonna say is that I met Deborah first time in, I think it was Summit 2018, or was it 2019? You won Speaker Idol, which I'm ever impressed by being able to deliver something that good in 5 minutes. I was super impressed, so I'm happy you're here.
Well, thank you. That was actually 2019 then.
All
So
right.
that's, yes. So for people on the line, if I'm looking over here, this is where I have my teams and I have the chat set up. So if you have questions, feel free to put those in chat. I will try to do breaks to give you a chance to answer questions. But if you have questions, definitely let me know. And with that, so go ahead and get started, is what you're saying?
Yes.
All right, so let me make sure I do the screen too. And hopefully y'all see my screen now.
I see a presentation.
All
Cool.
right. So thank you all so much for joining. For those in Europe, hope you have a easy Friday afternoon. For those who are waking up with me in the States, hope it's a good way to start your day. And thank you for getting up early and joining. So, oops. Here we go. All right. For those of you who don't know who I am, I've been working with the Microsoft Data Platform for over 20 years. Don't do the math. I've mainly worked with SQL Server and transactional systems, but I've done enough with other relational databases and data marts and warehouses, just enough so I could do damage in any of those systems. I'm a board member of the New England SQL Server User Group, which is the local Microsoft Data Platform user group. I'm also a member of the Azure Data Community Advisory Council. I decided to take Speaker Idol off and include that fact I was named as one of the Redgate 100 this couple months ago. And I'm most honored by the fact I'm a Microsoft MVP. I constantly strive to live up to that. But for me, it means I love giving presentations like this. I love sharing what I know and kind of my thoughts on different things going on in the data community. This is not the important stuff to remember about me, though. This is the important stuff to remember. I'm the alto section leader of my choir. I love doing bluegrass jams. They still kind of slow to start up after the pandemic and changing a little, but when I can go, I love doing it. As part of that, I've been learning guitar. I have a mandolin I'm neglecting. I'm kind of a musical theater geek, so definitely talk musical theater to me afterwards. And when I'm not doing any of that, my husband, Andy Yoon, and I like doing geeky things with our dog. If you were at this past data community summit, you would have seen us and Sebastian as part of that little keynote intro that they had. So that was a lot of fun. So this is the truly important stuff to know about me. But that's not why we're all here today. We're here to talk about database deployments. So why talk about the different ways that we deploy methods? Well, I think a lot of times we look at it and we say, we have our database, we have our changes, magic happens, and then we go to apply our changes to the databases. And so really this magic, it's not magic. It's a lot of detail. I feel like it's very detail oriented work and planning and strategies and such. It's not magic because of it, but we kind of gloss over the thing is we have our changes, magic happens, and the changes get deployed wherever they need to be. But there's just so much more to it that I feel like it's worth taking some time to kind of going back and making sure we understand it. A lot of times we talk about it under the construct of DevOps, development operations, and this concept that was built out of the agile environments and such. My hesitation with saying this is a DevOps session is it's really not just DevOps. We all have code we have to deploy. We have our changes in development. We need to take them to the next environments before and then get them to production. We all have to do that. And the funny thing that I think we also forget sometimes is this affects how we do our job every day. We have code. What do we do with it? This whole release process is part of our everyday workflow, whether we recognize it or not. A phrase I've heard is data ops. So instead of development ops, we deal with data and database specific. And I think it comes into play because of what the database is and the nature of our databases, and also all the little extra things that we don't think about, that when you think about developing an application and deploying that, we have extra consideration. So again, it's a phrase I'm hearing. I'm not opposed to it, but the real thing to remember is it doesn't matter if you're agile, doesn't matter if you're waterfall, doesn't matter if you're waterfall pretending to be agile, doesn't matter if you're agile pretending to be waterfall. If you have database changes, this is matters to you. Like, we're all affected by this, and we all need to think about how we're getting those changes through the different environments. So a couple terms I want to throw out there that if we want to kind of think about this, I don't know if it's academically, but think about it in a different way. A couple terms that we want to keep in mind. This first one, I'm not sure where I heard of it, and it almost felt like I was making it up. I don't think I am, but it's the concept of a source of truth. So essentially, we need some way to say this is what our database looks like at this given time. Not necessarily during the development cycle, but the time that we need to bring our code to the next level. Whether you're doing it through CI/CD, whether you have installers and specific versioning of your database or parts of your database. Um, we need to know at any point what our database looks like, and we need to be confident that it is correct. It's not to say that we don't need to make changes along the way, but we just need to have a way to say this is what was released or this is what should have been released. Um, it's really important because, again, everything else we need to do, we've got to guarantee that whatever we deploy is correct. And we need to know what correct looks like. I also like using a source of truth because I got to make changes. How do I know what that table is? So there are lots of good reasons to have a source of truth in addition to how we're deploying our database. This next one is one that I can't remember where I heard it, but it really strikes me, and especially as we talk about one of the deployment methods, this is a really interesting concept, and I think it's an important one to grasp, especially when we talk about deploying our database, and that's database as code. And in some ways, we kind of we kind of already start doing that when we think about the fact that we use source control. Well, what does it mean to check our database into source control? Our database is on a SQL Server instance. It's got data in it. That data could vary depending on what client, what environment, whatever you're doing. You know, there's things going on with the database that, you know, it's hard to visualize it as code. But really, it's the scripting out of the here are my database settings, here's my schema, here's the data I'm supposed to start off with, and being able to create that in a way that we can almost, I don't want to say consume it as code, but essentially work with it as we would any other code that a developer would work with. Again, that at one point, I think when I got started, you had that really strict line between this is developers, this is database. And so now we're kind of really embracing some of the benefits that we get by treating it that way. I mean, again, source control is a huge one. But again, thinking about how that works in terms of deploying, thinking of database as code is really a useful mindset, I think, for getting us moving in the right direction. All right, requirements. We have to talk about requirements. One of my big things is I hate when we say, here, we'll just pull this tool in place and we get this running and our problems are solved. And it's forgetting that a tool is not a solution. We still have to understand what we're trying to solve. And in order to solve it, we have to define our requirements. So some of this is kind of based on my personal requirements that I've developed over the years. One is I always want to be able to create a brand new database or upgrade an existing one. We never know when we need to create a brand new database from scratch. Or we need to see if we were to install it by scratch, what would all the different objects look like? What does our schema look like? Obviously, upgrade an existing one. If we've got we've got code to deploy. We are making changes. We're constantly making changes. So our requirements is we need to be able to do either. An important piece of this is whenever we're done with the deployment, if we did something based on a new install or a brand new database or an upgraded database, those schemas need to match. At the end, everything has to be the same. I mean, there is a caveat with an upgraded database because you may have deprecated store procedures, or maybe you actually did refactor that set of functionality where those 20 tables that did that one piece of work, you've actually designed it better. You've got your new database schema, your new set of tables, and you've left the old table so you can go back and reference the data later. It's much easier than trying to restore the entire database and figure out that that one row didn't migrate properly. So you may have exceptions like that, but again, it shouldn't matter when you deploy a database, whether it's brand new database or it's an upgraded database, you want your schemas to be the same. It goes back to that source of truth, making sure you know what everything is looking like so you can make sure your deploy is doing that in the end. And this last one is deploys must be rerunnable. The asterisk is really for my own personal reference. I like having scripts which are rerunnable. It's not always the case depending on what you do. We'll talk about that later, but at least the deployment is rerunnable. So no matter how many times I run that deployment, it's going to work. I can run that deployment against a database, which I've already run that deployment against, and it should still work and it shouldn't break anything. So really being able to do these multiple times, making that repeatable process that we always talk about as we start automating things, it really comes into play when we start thinking about our requirements. So now we can start talking about the types of deployments that we have. There's going to be a lot of things I talk about. Understanding the different deployments, in some ways, is almost the easier part. It's really understanding the implications of those and how that is the broader effect. So when we talk about those and when we start going to demos of that, you'll see a little bit more. But there are two main types of deployments that we have. One is migration-based deployment, and one is state-based deployment. So let's kind of go back and refamiliarize ourselves with these. I'm not sure what everyone's level is in having to work with this, or if you're working with it, have we thought about what it means for it? So we're going to start with migration-based deployment. The simple answer of what a migration-based deployment is you have a series of scripts executed to deploy your database changes. So we get to define what the change is and how we're making the change. So for example, on the left, we have a source database, and on the right, we have a target database. So in a migration-based deployment, we're going to say add one blue star, add one pink heart, add one green moon. We know what needs to be changed. We don't need to do anything. We just know we need the source to look like this, and here's how we add it. It could be, hey, if I've got if I don't have 4 stars, figure out how many stars I have and add it. But I can dictate those, but I get to control how that migration works because I know what's supposed to be, and I'm just going to tell you, just go do this. And at the end, everything should be the same. So there are a couple tools that you can use to do migration-based. This is not a complete exhaustive list. These are just, some of these are things I'm familiar with. And some of these things are things that, that we can use. So third-party tools, there are 2 ones that I'm mentioning here, Liquibase and Flyway. Yes, there are others. I think DB Maestro does some things. I think they consider themselves both state-based and migration script, but we can kind of talk about that later. Actually, I'm not too familiar with that tool, but again, the concept of how we mix state and migration will come into play. But both of those are third-party tools, and they essentially run migration scripts. There's a little details to how you set those up, but both of those are options. You can also do this with homegrown tools, PowerShell and DBA tools. I'll be using PowerShell in my example in a moment. SQL command, so any sort of command line utility that will run a script. When I first got started, I had to create migration scripts, and I pretty much had a batch file that ran SQL command to each of these scripts that needed to be run. So there are definitely options to run migration scripts. It's just you get to control what the scripts look like as well as how you run them. State-based migration. So this is where we talk about a comparison. So I have what my database looks like. Here's my target. I'm going to do a compare. It's going to figure out what change needs to be made and applies it. And this is where DACPAC, data application tier packages, come into play. And the version of that with data is actually called BAC with a B or boy, backpack. So that one is the same as the DACPAC, but just with data. But again, we have a comparison. We know what our database looks like, and we compare and we go with whatever happens to be in the database. So the visualization, same source, same target that we had before. Now with a state base, we have our comparison against the two, and then we apply the changes. Often we'll get a script of what that looks like, but again, we're not, well, you'd have to script it out and then modify it if you need changes made. But really, it's the comparison, something else is deciding how you apply those changes. I mentioned DACPACs and backpacks for a reason, just because that's a common model I think we see for databases, or especially SQL Server databases. I can't speak for some of the other database systems, but at least in the Microsoft data platform world, that's what we use. You have tools like SQL Package, which is a command line utility. If you're using database projects in Visual Studio, they do exist in VS Code and Azure Data Studio, so you can use a deploy option from there. I think the Redgate SQL change automation also works as a state-based. Hopefully I got that correct. If not, we can move it to a different third-party tool category. But you can also do homegrown tools. DBA Tools has a published DACPAC package module. Oh, I actually worked at a company once where they had created their own internal comparison tool where you had a little executable and it had what the schema was supposed to look like. And when you ran the executable, it compared against the database and created what the changes were. So technically you can make your own homegrown tool. I think some of these other tools make it so it's not necessary. But again, these things are different options and you can choose how you want to do those. So at this point, let's jump into demos. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know I'm probably talking very fast, but if you need anything, definitely put it in chat. I am keeping my eye out over here to make sure I capture those. All right, so I'm going to start with migration scripts. So I'm going to go over well, first I'm going to explain how I set things up, but I'm going to go ahead and start with my Azure Data Studio. And I'm going to connect to my 2019 instance. And in here, I've got 3 different databases that we'll play with. We're starting with this first one, which is called Depolyment. So this is really a starter database that I wanted to create. So the first thing that I'm doing is I created a stored procedure that generated a given number of tables or simple lookup tables, 3 columns, and a stored procedure to select from those lookup tables. So I have 500 lookup tables and 500 stored procs that I've created. And then I created a database project in Visual Studio, which we'll look at next. But the first thing we will look at is a migration. So essentially, I scripted out the database into a series of scripts from Management Studio, and I saved them into a folder. So I go here, well, just hold here that for a moment. So this is my Windows Explorer, and we can see I have a tables folder, a store procedures folder, a schema, and I have a PowerShell script. So let's take a look at that PowerShell script a little more. In some ways, this is a very, very basic PowerShell script. If I do the session again, I may make this a little fancier, just, because we can. But I decided to go with a very absolute basic. So starting off with, I'm giving it my location, which is where I have my scripts. I'm saying the instance I want to connect to and the database that I'm going to connect to. So again, I can parameterize these if I wanted to make this more, I guess, production ready or QA ready, whatever I need to do, I can parameterize this in my PowerShell script and run through it that way. I'm changing to the location of my files. And then what I'm doing is I'm setting the order of the folders that I want to go through. So I know how I want things to set up, and I know I want things to go in a certain order, but I don't want to worry too much about defining that strict order when I run through my scripts. Um, it can be a lot. Again, right now my database has 500 tables and 500 stored procs. That's a lot to organize if I have to sit there and say which one I want to do manually, say this is the order. That's kind of a pain. So I'm going to rotate through this folder order. I decided to, this is a shout out to Magnus because we're both on team Define Your Constraints. I'm putting my foreign keys in its own folder. So again, I don't have to worry about order of the tables install if I add my foreign keys to that script. The other thing I'm doing is I'm creating a log table so I can kind of keep track of which scripts were run, when they were run. I could make this more expansive, but essentially I'm just going to sit there and say, I ran the script. I started running the script here. At second entry, I ended the script here. This is actually something that I know third-party tools like Liquibase and Flyway both use as a way to say, hey, have I run this script before? Oh, I've run it. I don't need to do it again. They have a little more logic built into that. So if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, that may work for you. Then I'm going through, so I'm adding those scripts first. Notice I need these to run, especially if it's a brand new database, because I want this to run to either create everything from scratch or be able to run an upgrade. I don't want to have to think about that. I just want to use my one script. So if it's not there, I'm going to run it. I'm going to make sure it's there. And I need to have those run before anything else because, again, I'm defining the objects or the folders that things need to run in, but I'm not defining run this script first within that. And then you can see my basic script. I have a section for each thing. So if I have schemas, run those. If I have tables, run those. If I have foreign keys. Notice I didn't have everything before in my folder structure, so if I add something later, my script will automatically pick it up. So we're going to start by going through our deployments. I created a notebook for this just because it felt like a nice way to do it, and I can have everything in the same place. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my server, connect to master database, and I'm going to drop and recreate my migration database plain. We're starting completely from scratch. So now I'm going to run my PowerShell script that I just showed you. And we can see that I put a little comments to say where we were because I hate running a script line. I need to know where we are. And that's just my personal preference. But again, I can see that I've run through schemas. It's now adding my 500 tables. It's now adding my 500 stored procedures. Taking a second. And now that's done. So now I have my database has all the objects, and I can confirm that objects exist. I'm creating a new connection to that database. And now I'm selecting the top 10 tables and then the things from the log. So again, or just random 10 tables, we can see they exist. And now we can look at my log file and we can see the results. So things worked as I expected it to. But now I want to add something. I want to add data. So I've got a script here that I've created for lookup data. So I'm going to go here and let's do it this way so you can actually make sense to view. Going to open file. So essentially for one of my lookup tables, I've generated random 100 records and we're going to put those in. And here's the thing with the migration scripts. I'm defining what needs to be done. Because remember, my script, I'm saying I'm running it if it's a brand new database or I'm running it with an upgrade. And so with migration scripts, we really have to think about data changes. What needs to happen if there's data there, especially if there's client data there. I don't want to have different scripts based on environment A or environment B. I want everything to be there and have it work. So so this particular case, I know that this lookup table, it's defined for the application. This is what I want to do, I know what it is. I don't want any changes made to it, because if someone makes a change to it, the application is going to blow up and that would be bad. So if someone added records, I want to delete any records which are there that we no longer need. If there's changes, I want to make those changes. I want to make sure I do an update on that lookup. That ID is clearly defined, so I want to make sure everything matches. And if anything's missing, I want to insert. But we have to think about like what updating or deleting data could mean if you have a client, or even inserting data. Sometimes we insert default data because it needs to be there for the applications to start, and then the client can change it however they want it to be. Sometimes there's a mix of data. We have our records that need to be there. The clients can modify their own. So maybe we modify only ours, and we need to make sure that if the client adds, or maybe the client is just always adding their own. So again, we need to understand how that data is being used, especially in production or other environments. So we make sure that whenever we run the deployment, we don't accidentally create problems with data. So that's kind of one of the key things to think about with our migration scripts, is how those work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this script, I'm going to add it to my folder and add it to my migration process. So again, we're confirming I don't have any data in my lookup table that we're modifying. I'm going to take the copy that I have in my demo files. I'm going to add the direct data directory, which I didn't have before, and copying the file over. And then I'm going to run my PowerShell script and we will see our data added. So I've added this one there, and this one is really more for demo purposes. If you're actually working on this in code, you may just go ahead and save your data script there. It may not be saved in a different directory. I mean, it could be, but you're probably going to work directly there. And we can see that everything ran much quicker, and we now see that our data folder has been added and it's been run. So now I can run my lookup, and we can now see that I have data in my table. So the last thing to kind of consider with migration scripts is, what if we're going to need to make a more intricate change? This was easy. I'm just adding a new file in. One of the things is we're running things over and over again. Things may already exist. How do we handle changes like that? One example I'm going to show you is thinking about a schema change. So I mentioned I created a something to generate a store procedure that would generate all my dummy tables and all my dummy store procedures. So I had objects, a lot of objects I could start to play with. Well, I put that under my DBO schema. Here, let's go over to Explorer and we can look at that. So we have the store procedure going up here, and it's under DBO, and it's a dummy tables and proc creation, and this is what my script currently looks like. I notice a couple things. One, we can kind of talk about, this is a migration script. I don't know if something exists or not. I don't care. I just want my script to work. And this is actually how Management Studio scripted everything out. It creates the shell of a store procedure and then it alters it. So if it's not there, we at least have something and we can always alter it. It's a little funky, but it works. I think create or alter procedures a little cleaner, but we'll move to that in just a second. But again, I'm creating this as DBO. It doesn't make sense to be DBO. I want to kind of organize my scripts, essentially, since I've got 500 other store procedures in my schema, it's a little unwieldy. So I'm going to classify it something else. So I have a script for a new schema called demo setup. I want to move my store procedure to that new schema. But I also have to remember that I've got a naming convention. I'm putting my schema as part of the name convention. I personally like that. I like going into my source control. I like looking at a file, and I like knowing exactly what I'm going to see in that file. So DBO dot, I'd expect something in the DBO schema, not in a demo setup. So I'm going to deal with that. So let's take a look at how that works. So again, I happen to have everything in my demo files directory. So I'm going to start off with, I have my script, my change script, what I want this to be. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go to my demo script. Oops. Over here. going to save that. And now I've got a script for my schema. And because of create schema syntax, I have to put this in exec because I only want to add the schema if it's not there. So I'm going to file, I'm going to save this as migration, schema, save. Now the other thing is we notice that my store procedure is the DBO dot. I want to change that. Well, this affects source control and I want to keep everything connected. So I'm going to go back to my folder, store procedures, rename through, I'm going to use tortoise git for this one. This is just how I like to do it. I know you can do it through other ways, but this way I know it's going to be done the way I want it to work because I'm very picky about things. I like knowing how things are going to work. My rename is here. And so now that I have everything set, I should be able to run my PowerShell script, and then we can check to see if that works. Merge, there's a couple questions while that's going. The first one is add data file expected an MDF file. Looks like we're populating, inserting data. Yes, that's what I'm talking about here is I'm adding data. It's a data script. Again, the .data.SQL, that's just my personal naming convention, or the one I'm using for here. It can be whatever you want it to be. So sorry for that little confusion. I get where you're coming from with that. The next question, how about using merge syntax to arrange data in tables? Technically, that is an option. I avoid merge syntax. This gets into a different conversation. Merge syntax has a bunch of bugs that are known for, that it's known for, and different things. So I don't trust merge syntax. Again, there's a whole series of blog posts. There's one by Aaron Bertrand, and there's one by Michael Swart that I would refer you to. But if it works for you, you can use it. I just tend to avoid merge syntax just because I know there's a lot of problems and a lot of bugs with it that I don't trust it. Again, this gets into me and having a very controlling attitude over my scripts that I prefer those. I prefer to write those out. So, but that would be a different way to do it. But it is definitely an option if it works for you. Again, I would read up on some of those syntax again. But that's just me. But those are great questions. Thank you. So now our deployment script has run, and I'm going to do a test. And my test is really just seeing what schema is my stored procedure in, and we can see down here it is demo setup. So again, one of the things with migration, as kind of pointed out, is what syntax do you use for updating data? How do you do some of this stuff? Some of it does get into personal preference, but it's also the requirement of what we're using migration scripts for. I showed you the store procedure, the way that script works. Let me show you the way it created the data or the table script. And again, I scripted this out for Microsoft. I did it for 500 objects. I really would love to clean these up because there's all this extra stuff that I tend not to use in my scripts. But you get the basic idea of how you can do this. If not exists, my table, create it. And that's a pretty standard format. And for most of my career, I've used migration scripts. So this is something that's very familiar to me. The biggest question is, what do I do when I want to upgrade a table? Where do I put that? Do I want that in the same script? Do I want to keep separate scripts for table upgrades? Because I have done the same script where any change I make, I put in the same file. So for my lookup table, my first one is for brand new. Here's what my table should look like. And then underneath, we can kind of see the history of all the different changes we've had to make, over the different versions in order to get it to that point. So there are a couple different options. It's going to depend a lot on your requirements. So that's where some of the details of how you set up your migration scripts work are going to come into play. So, but thinking about this syntax of a migration script, we're now going to transfer over to how we deal with a state-based migration, because this is actually one of the small details that you have to deal with when you use something like a database project. And that's what I'm going to use for our state-based migration. So if you have any other questions, feel free to put those in chat. I'm going to keep trucking along. So I'm going to now move over to Visual Studio. Visual Studio with projects, I feel like it's a little more complete functionality. You can absolutely do this in Azure Data Studio, but again, for the purpose of the demo, I'm just going to keep it here for now. So a database project, this is where we start thinking of databases as code, and we have solutions and we have projects. Again, I had mostly worked kind of coming up with some of the stuff on my own. I didn't know about some of this stuff. So I've always worked with migration. I'm having to work with database projects a lot more. And so for me to learn about them, that's actually one of the other reasons why I wanted to do a session like this. It's a nice excuse that I get to understand this better and really think about how it works so I could work with it as well. So the way we work with our database project is we have a solution here. I'm going to undo this for now. We have our solution. I'm calling it database project. We have different things that we can do with it. We can set up properties for this. So I'm going to open our properties, and we have different things we can do. And when I start saying database as code, this is where we get into some of these things. We have things like project settings. So I can set there and set what my target platform is. But I can talk about properties for my DAG pack and creating scripts, or if I wanted to create the script. This build, this is really kind of, for me, what makes it the projects and thinking database as code. Because when you work with migration scripts, it's just the script and you're running the scripts. The concept of the build, though, again, I'm used to that being from a developer world. A programmer has gone in, they've written their C# code, they're building their application. And so for me, it's a really hard concept to get here to understand the build from this concept. But essentially what the build is taking your scripts. It does checks to make sure everything is valid to the best of its ability. And then it will come up with the output, which is that DAC pack, the data application package. And you have other things you can do in terms of setting references, and let's talk about references. But I really wanted to point out the build as part of the database project settings. So I'm going to go back over here. So references, this is the next thing. I'm going to, it talks about making, when you do a build, and make sure everything that you have is valid. It does basic syntax check. But if you have things such as cross-database references, it wants to make sure that those are valid as well. So if you have a reference to a different database, even if it's the master database, let's say you have dynamic SQL and you're using SP execute SQL. I've had cases where I had to make sure I'm adding that as a reference. So you have a couple different options. I'm going to point out the database reference because that gets to what we were just talking about. Your database project, you can have multiple projects in the same solution. So if you need to logically have everything for the same database, but functionally you want to keep this code base being able to release separately from this set of code, you can do that within your database project. I actually have one I've set up that way recently. But you can do things like I can add a reference for a system database, master or MSDB, or I can set it to a specific DAC pack. So you can't say a specific database on a system, but you do get to define things like your database location. So this way, if you have those cross-database references, when you do a build, it says, hey, you have a reference to this object and it doesn't exist yet. So it can fail your build, and you can make sure, again, trying to make sure that everything that you have for your code is as correct as possible before it goes to the next step. And then what it does is it organizes your scripts. Again, I auto-generated this, and the way I auto-generated it, the option I chose was your schema and then the object type within. So I have my database object. I went ahead and threw my data script in here. But again, I have all my stored procedures. And again, 500 takes a while. And then I have my tables. Now, one thing we'll notice here is I'm going to go, it already accidentally clicked on one of the stored procedures. It's taking a while, a lot of objects. Let's go look at this stored procedure that I have, because we saw what it looked like when I did a migration script. Notice for the database projects, it's just create proc. And this is actually one of the things you have to know when you're handling scripts in a database project, especially for those builds. You do not have the create or alter option. You do not have the if exists, don't do it, or if not exists, create. Because essentially, think about the way that this is going to work is it's a comparison. It's going to figure out what needs to change. You don't need to do that. It just needs to know what the object looks like. So this is, I'm creating my procedure and this is what it looks like. And that's it. So you don't get the choice to do that for most things. And we'll get to that in just a second. But now that we see what our project looks like, I'm going to right click. Let's go over here so you can see it. And I'm going to choose build. Again, it's not a concept I'm used to because again, it's code, but essentially it's taking all my objects, it's making sure everything's valid, confirming interdependencies. Here, as I said, validating the model, and then my build succeeded. The important things to note are here, which are the artifacts of it. It does create a DLL, but more importantly, it creates a DAC pack. So let's go take a look at inside our DAC pack. I'm going to go over here. And I'm going to, so it puts everything in this debug folder, and I have my DAC pack. So for those who don't know, a DAC pack is really just a zip file. So I'm making a copy of it, and I'm going to append it with .zip. Yes, I want to make that change. And now we can actually see what's inside our DAC pack. We have different contexts. We have our DAC pack metadata, but most importantly is this model XML. I went ahead and I've saved this in my demo files. And so let's take a look at this. And we can see it is an XML file. We can see things like our database options if we want to do that, because you can deploy a DAC pack and it'll add your database settings if you so desire. The next thing, we're creating a store procedure. And now we can see the body of each store procedure here. If we want to look for a table, let's go here. Let's look up 10. Actually, let's go to the next one. That's the store procedure. All right, so now we have our table options. So I've always find this interesting how the DAC pack puts it together, which is why I'm sharing it with y'all. We see our columns that are defined here. We see the schema relationship, and that's it. Our indexes get stored separately. Our constraints get stored separately in a different place in the XML file. But also, if you notice the column, it doesn't say the column order here. It just assumes that the order that's created in the XML is going to be the order that you're going to deploy these in. But remember, column order, whether it matters or not, it has its own issues. But again, someone's going to put select stars somewhere and it's going to blow things up because columns are out of order depending on how you create it here. It's more just you have to be aware that what that looks like. It's, again, I'm more intrigued that it's not here rather than saying it's a problem, but it all depends on if you do modify this XML manually, what sort of issues you may create with it. Because again, it's not going to translate to the script, it translates to the XML that then gets used for your DAC pack. Again, more of a curiosity note. But I also mentioned the backpack, which is starting with the letter B as in boy, because that actually has our data in it. So what I did is I created from my deploy me starter kit, starter database, I created a backpack here. And again, it's just a zip file. So when I go in, we now notice this looks the same as what we have in our DAC pack with a D, but we now have a data folder. And I added data for that one table. And now we can see that, ooh, BCP, bulk copy protocol. It's been a while since I've seen those. So I'm going to take a copy of that. I put it in my demo files, and I'm going to open that up in Notepad. And oh, look, I see my data. I see my data in plain text. So bulk copy protocols is a really fast way to load your data from flat files, but as you can see, I can actually read data. So if you're using the backpack with a B as in boy, you may want to be careful where you store those files or who has access to those, especially if you have any sensitive data that you don't want just anyone to have access to. I tend to work with DACpack with the D more. Backpacks at one point were used, they're still used, not at one point, but you can use those to deploy your on-prem database to an Azure SQL database with 2022 and your managed instance link and some of that failover and being able to kind of restore between the two. I don't know what that means for Azure SQL, honestly, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. So back to our project. We have the build, and so now I want to deploy my database. So I'm going to right-click on my project, and I'm going to choose Publish. So it does the build, and then I get options. Let's go down here a little more so we can see everything. First, I'm going to choose my target database. I'm hitting, there it goes. Whoops, I want my state database. And I can save my profile and make it reusable. But right now, I can also just generate a script. There's a cool thing, I can register this as a data application to your application. There, I have a blog post in the resources on how you can use this to help version your database, use this as versioning and use that kind of help manage database drift, schema drift. So there's some cool things with that. But right now, I'm just going to hit publish. And so now what it's doing is it's doing the compare. I have my DACpack. I know what it looks like. It knows it's looking at that state database. It's figuring out what the changes are. That state database right now is empty. I have no tables in it. So now I'm doing the compare. It's created what the script is, and now it's running that script against that database. So we can now see that it's different create stuff along the way. All right, so seeing if there's any questions while this runs. For tables, it's easy to check if it exists, but when checking for the columns, there's a lot to check. Like if the column exists, if the data type's correct, I'm assuming, and let me kind of go over here and look at the rest of your comment. Yeah, if the data type's correct, if the precision's correct, are you also doing the same? Are you also doing it the same way? Absolutely, Manish. That's a great point. And think about, if you're doing migration script, you absolutely need to keep track of all of those things. How are you checking those? How are you making those changes? And then you get the fun things. Hey, I'm making a change here. Is anything referencing this column? Do I have any default constraints on it? Because sometimes different constraints, whether it's unique constraints or I forget which ones, but sometimes when you tested it, I'd have a problem. So I'd have to say, if my constraint exists, drop it, make my change to the column. I'm making a not null column. I don't want a default on it, but there could be data. I need a default data to populate this new column I'm adding not null. So I can then drop a default, make sure there's no default constraint because there shouldn't be one. So yeah, absolutely. A lot of considerations with migration scripts or just making changes to columns in general that you have to think about. We'll get to that just a second when we start thinking about some of the additional things that I want to add here for my project. But one of the things I want to show you quickly are now that my project has deployed, it ran successfully, the big thing here is my view script. So I'm going to hop over, take a look at that. And notice something here. This is actually using SQL command mode for my SQL. And that's how it's going to do things like set variables. So when I have references, I can set different parameters. So I can say, here's what my database name, here's what my path is. So different things I can parameterize along the way. Again, it's using SQL command mode to execute. Then it's using the database, and then it's going to go through and making all of the changes that need to be made. And everything is done as a create. Why? Because there was nothing in the database before. Now, one thing to note is I have a data folder. And if we look at the data script, we can see that this is the same data script I had before. I mentioned that database builds are very particular about the format. Everything is create. You also can only have one statement. And notice here, I'm doing a lot of different things in this script. It's the same one we looked at before. If I did a build, this should blow things up. But it doesn't, because while it's as part of the project, the property for the script, there's a build action and it's set to none. So while I'm making sure it's included, I'm not running it by default. What the reason why is, again, think about it, it's not handling data, it's looking at the comparison for the schema. It doesn't know how to handle this, or we want it to be handled differently. So I'm setting it to none, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add what's called a post-deployment script. So after everything runs, I want it to run my data. So I'm going to add a new item, and actually with the projects, it gives me options. It has a bunch of templates. And I'm going to do a post-deployment script. And I'm just going to add. And again, it's going to be a SQL command. So I'm going to actually happen to have it over here again in my demos. So you don't have to see me fully type in. So I now have this here. And again, it'll be SQL command. So it should run. So now when I do my publish, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to just build to make sure I didn't do anything. I have a failure because I did something wrong. The included file does not exist, which is weird because deploy me DBO. Oh, I have an extra DBO here. So let's take a look. Oh, because I added in my DBO directory. I normally add it up a level, which is fine if we can work with this. So again, we can kind of see the cool thing of what happens when you do a build. If you have a failure, unexpected demo, but that works. My build now works. And so now I can go publish. I'm going to same database. I'm going to publish. Takes a couple seconds. Don't forget to turn on the bell for the notifications. Interesting. Yep. Seeing if
That's
there's any
from me.
questions while waiting. I'm sorry?
There was a question about will this be posted online, and I said it's going to come up to my YouTube channel, and so.
Yep. And again, all my scripts I'm going to make available on our GitHub, on my GitHub when this is done. I want to make sure everything works first. But I did a publish. And then if I go back, I'm going to go to query. Where is it? Let's go to, actually, sorry, clicking around because I forgot where I was going to go. And now my machine is acting weird. But again, it just ran my script, and then it added data to that database. I'm missing the view for my Object Explorer, which I have here. Other windows. I lost my Object Explorer. Oh, SQL Object Explorer. There we go. Because what I wanted to show you is now I can go to database. I can my state database, my new query. Look up 10. And we can now see that down here. It's a little hard to see because of Visual Studio, but we can now see my data has been added. The one consideration I want to bring up with this is what happens if I do that same schema change that I made earlier. So I'm going to add a new folder called Demo Setup. I'm going to add an existing item. I'm going to go back to my demo folder. and I'm going to grab that same schema I had before. And then I'm going to take this, my store procedure, I'm going to take that, and I'm going to add that to my demo setup folder. I'm probably, actually, I want to move this folder up a level. So I have my demo set up here. I need to make sure I have these changes. This is just a create procedure. I'm going to change this to be demo setup. And then this I need to change to get rid of the if exists. So I'm adding my schema. So now the question is, I'm moving my dummy table to a different schema. It is the same one we had before, but I want to make sure that works. So I'm going to quickly do my build just to make sure I did everything correctly. It succeeded, and now I'm going to publish. I'm not going to actually publish, but I want to show you the script that's created, because that's really what I'm interested in right now. So I'm just going to hit generate script. Yep. Oh, thank you for answering that one, Magnus. It's a great question. Manish asked if possible to do the deployment using SQL package. Um, Magnus points out that when we are doing this deploy, it is using SQL package underneath the cover. So yes, that's true. So some of these things are using the same things, but we don't always see how it's working. So this is my script that got published. So notice a couple things. I'm creating the schema here, but notice it's also creating the procedure. Why? Because we did a compare. It knows that this procedure doesn't exist, but it doesn't know that we wanted to modify the procedure. We just wanted to move it. We don't want to leave a version of the DBO there, and we don't want to just drop it. We want to alter it and move it to this new schema. Maybe we want the procedure name to be the same so we can still find things in Query Store. A compare may not catch that subtle difference. So again, this is where pre-deployment scripts exist or post-deployment scripts. So we can kind of find out the ways to manage those instances where a compare is not going to quite figure out what we want to do. The other thing I'll point out is if we go to the end of the script, our post-deployment script here for that data still exists. Why? Because we say after the deployments, run this. We're not comparing the data. We just say run the script at the end. So it's always going to run if whatever you have in the post-deployment script or even the pre-deployment script. So those are essentially our migration scripts that we're adding to a state-based to handle cases the state-based doesn't handle. So this is a very simplified version of what we're working with, and it gets a lot more intricate, but kind of understanding the basics gets you a lot there so you can start working out some of the other issues. So I'm looking quickly to see if there's other questions. Magnus, thank you for adding that command line option in the chat. And again, there are definitely a lot more parameters, a lot more stuff you can do with this. I'm just working on the basic examples so we can kind of get the understanding of how these work so we can think about the next level. Someone last time scripted out 800 databases using the scripter. That's a cool tip, Andre, so thank you for sharing that. So I know we're coming close to the end of time. So a couple other things to consider. There's a lot of considerations. And if you notice, most of what I was doing had to do with the details around how I'm keeping the script. So things like source control, our folder structure, our naming conventions. A lot of these we get to define. Some of the third-party tools, we have to go with their convention because they're using that to kind of keep control of how they use things. So it's a silly thing, but it's a really important detail we have to keep track of and make sure we deal with it as part of source control and code reviews and all of those fun things. We need to think about where things are deploying to. What can we expect to find in those different environments, especially if we have multiple people working in the same project on different things and everything's getting deployed together or even partially deployed together. The release process in general. How are you setting up your CI/CD pipelines? are you still using installers? I've worked at companies fairly recently where we had the installer because that's how the application worked. Clients supported it on their own, and so we just need to find a way that they could update their databases on their systems. Are you doing feature releases? Are you doing versioned releases? How are you doing releases? And most importantly, I hate saying the word chain of command, but it's kind of the best way of saying who's responsible for the process? Are the release engineers you need to coordinate with? Um, how does it work with the app developers? Uh, all of those different things, everyone has to buy into the process. Because again, if you're doing a code check into source control, you have the file. It's not just clicking approve because this needs to get in, but is the script named properly? Is it going to work? All the different things that we have to keep in mind. Hey, we're doing a column. Have we column change? We have all these different details to work. Are we missing anything as part of the upgrade that could cause it to be a problem if it's a migration script? Have you done a build if it's a project to make sure it works? So there's a lot of different details, and everyone needs to buy in to make sure that the process is going to deploy properly. How long do you have to deploy? The other thing is even for the script, I've worked places where we had the connection to run this file was only 30 seconds. I'm adding an index to a table that could have a couple million records in it. It's going to take more than 30 seconds to do. So I have to write a script to figure out, can I do it in that deployment window, or do I need to, let's say, create an index overnight when I have time and I know I can give it all the time it needs to complete. So different options to think about for that. Data changes, we kind of already talked about what's going to exist. What happens if that data script runs again? Is that going to create problems? Installs versus upgrades. We kind of touched on that. What do we do for new databases versus an upgraded database? Do you want the same set of scripts to run? Do you want different set of scripts to run? So on and so forth. Where do you want to store those changes? Testing. Probably the most important one, and I'm leaving it to one little bullet point hidden here. You got to test your deploys. You have to make sure they work. And you have to make sure that the end result is exactly what it's supposed to be. Going back to your source of truth. How do you know that your deployment is successful? And how do you know that you've included everything you need to in your deployment? Start dealing with things like client customizations or schema drifts. We like to think that we're the only ones who, we've got the control over the database and we're the only ones who are doing changes. I wish that were true, but there could be an extra index added, or they added something on the client side, customization, depending on how things work. Do you need to deal with those sort of issues, and how do you want to handle those cases? Which gets into one I really didn't get into a lot here, but the idea of what happens if you have errors during a deploy. Upgrade, and I'm using the word rollback in quotes because we really don't roll back our databases. If we modify a store procedure and we need to go back to a previous version, we are modifying the store procedure again. We're just going to it's not rolling back the version that was there. We're just running a new version of it. So how do we handle errors, especially if you have a large number of changes that are going out? What happens if there's an error? Does everything need to roll back? Um, Again, even if the application changes and you have to roll everything back, do you have to consider those things? How do we manage those? It's not an easy question to figure out. None of these are really easy if you think about it. And in some ways, you may have more questions than answers because when you're setting these things up, understanding migration-based deployment or state-based deployment, in some ways that's almost the easy part, right? Migration, I define everything. It's in my scripts. I am telling you exactly how this works. State-based, here's what things look like. Go figure out what the changes are. That part seems to me to be the easy part. It's the entire strategy overall, all the little details and all the different ways everything works together. That's hard. And that you have to get a lot of buy-in on. And you have to think about not just how am I making it work today, but is it going to work next year? What do you want it to still work the same way next year? I don't know. But these are all questions and little detail questions for planning and figuring things out and how you're going to test and work with everything. that you need to deal with. So in some ways, hopefully, the basic pieces of how they work is the easy part. Making it work for your system, if I left you with more questions on how that works than answers, I partially apologize. But again, these are the things that we really have to work out. And I don't have answers for those. I can just tell you, think about how everything works together and what you need to do. So that way you can set up the tools properly to make sure that happens. As I mentioned, I have a lot of resource slides here. Some of these are different tools that are available. So you were asking about SQL package. I've got the Microsoft documentation here, a little more about database projects. Flyway and Liquidbase are just two of the resources from migration scripts. If you want a third-party tool to assist you with those, they're not the only ones, but those are just two options. Some blog posts that kind of helped me figure out a good way to explain these to you. So I'm sharing those here. One of them is DB Maestro, which again is another tool used for database deployment. They kind of call themselves a mix between migration and state-based, but I really like their description here. A couple other blog posts. I mentioned the one about the versioning your data, your DAC pack. So I included that one here. And I saw this last one I saw over the past couple days. So I was like, oh, look, how to deploy database project changes. So I threw that one in as well. So I know I'm a little bit over, so thank you all for staying with us. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I feel like I've been throwing a lot of stuff here, but there's a lot to think about with this stuff. So if you have any questions, let me know. You have my, I'm on Twitter. I've just joined Mastodon, so I'm still figuring that out. But I have a blog, and I'm going to be uploading all of this stuff to my GitHub later, so you'll have access to that as well, so you can play with that as well. And you can reach me, you can contact me through those. So with that, thank you all so much for coming and staying a little later than intended. Sorry for those extra 10 minutes, but hopefully you got something out of it. Thank you. Thank you all. So any other questions in the chat?
No questions, just thank yous. And I agree. Thank you for a great session. And I do agree as well that it leaves, there's always more questions after a session than before. Now I understand what I don't know, basically, that feeling.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to put it. You have to understand what you don't know so you can figure things out. And again, so this was for me too. Like I'm relatively new to database projects. They aren't new, but they're new to me. So understanding how those work is really important, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just something silly. Rename a column. How do you do that without the DAC pack? Yeah, trying to drop the column and create a new one. And so read up on those things before you just go to production with it.
Well, this is also where it goes into testing. You got to have a good test environment. And I personally always liked migration scripts because I could test my script. I know exactly what's going to run out, what's going to go out, how it's supposed to run, and I can feel confident in my script. It doesn't mean that I didn't run into issues every now and then, because again, there are things that you didn't expect, or someone made a change and you're like, why is that change there? But again, it definitely requires a good test environment, not just if you're using migration scripts, but if you're doing DAC packs, you want to make sure those work. What are you going to miss? Because again, we added a column. Is it going to, it's a not null column and I don't want a constraint for it. Is a DAC pack deployment going to work the way I want it to?
Yeah, and make sure to test with data. That's also like a mistake I've done. Well, deployment works, but I'm deploying to a database where I didn't have any data in that table that I changed. Well, then of course the change is going to work. So it's all kinds of. It's hard to test, but it's so super important to do it.
Yeah, and again, it's Bruno points out, with a new column, Redgate Compare could do a table rebuild. Maybe you don't want to do it because it's a million record table at a production site. I mean, and also, yeah, testing with data. Like I'm also doing stuff where I don't have a lot of references. I don't have any foreign keys set up in my databases. I have 500 objects, but no foreign keys. Does that change how long things take and those different things to be considered? So, yeah. lots of different things to consider. But if you understand the basic concepts of how they work, you can figure out the workarounds or make it work.
Yeah, and I think the good thing also with this community, there is someone who has whatever I want to do, someone has done it, and they will help. Someone will just use the Twitter or Mastodon tag SQL help. It's incredible how fast and how good the replies are. So.
Oh yeah. And again, I'm not even doing things like, okay, I have an AG, so how does this change affect my availability groups and
Yeah,
anything that, or I'm doing replication. I'm not even touching on some of those different intricacies. I'm just dealing with a basic database. So those also make things a lot more complex and things you have to consider.
I like your session idea, Lars. Session idea deployment horror stories. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. I also approve.
Yeah, I'll let you come to the next season if you do that session, Lars.
I'm just a baby on these. I'm still learning.
We all
We're
are.
all still there.
As I said, most of my career, I've had to deal with migration scripts because I've always worked on the development side of the house. And I've been doing this for much longer than I care to admit. And I'm still learning ways to rethink these things, or new ways that people are doing this, or new products or tools that can help us. So you're never done.
And speaking of speaking and being new, we're all new to something. And I just posted the link to the call for speakers for the next season. And I really do encourage, if you never did a presentation before, I think this is a pretty good format to do it. I mean, Deborah is a pro and has done it for a long time. But if it's your first time, we'll hook you up with a mentor and who will help you out with the presentation and do your do your rehearsals and give you some feedback, because I think the more the merrier when it comes to speakers in the community.
Oh, absolutely. We all have different experiences and different things to add on the same topics. So, and 100% agreed with the reach out. We'll find mentors for you. I hate New Stars of Data. Didn't they put out a call for speakers?
Yeah, they're
Uh,
running another round as well, which
so
is
that's a great forum for new speakers. So I'll throw something out there for them.
and the Dep2 is coming to SQL Friday next week. She did her
Yeah.
first talk on New Stars of Data, and I think the year after she did around 100 presentations in a year.
Yeah. She
so
was actually I was actually her mentor for New Stars of Data.
oh, good. You did
So
good.
yeah, she did it all. Like, I'm her cheerleader. I helped her, and then everything else she did after that, that is all her. I can't even take, couldn't even try to take credit for that. She took what she had and just ran with it, and it's amazing to see, and it's so great.
Yeah, I mean, I feel kind of stressed if I have two presentations the same week. And I've had her on SQL Friday when she's like, I need to run now because I'm doing another presentation on another virtual conference in 5 minutes. I'm like, I don't know how you do that. But
Yeah.
she's coming next week.
Great.